Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you for your patience. I'm Christopher Spiro. This presentation is dedicated to the memory of our friend that we lost too soon, Isaiah Trofimenko. We'd like to thank Metropolitan Nicholas, the Cathedral Warden, Sergei Akushin, and the Cherubim Foundation for making this afternoon's event possible. So I majored in the Japanese language at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I studied abroad at Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan, and I wrote my senior thesis about the life and work of St. Nicholas of Japan. So this presentation is kind of going to expand on that research, and we're going to look at the religious history of Japan a little bit so that we understand what St. Nicholas encountered when he arrived. And we'll also look briefly at the Japanese Orthodox Church today. So the experience of St. Nicholas begins in Russia, and many of you may already be familiar with the religious history of Russia. And because there's so much material to cover, we're going to jump right in with Japan. So this is a map of Japan. Japan is an island nation in the Pacific. It is composed of literally thousands of islands, with four major islands, which are Honshu, which is this long island here. The northernmost island is Hokkaido, which is located up here. The southernmost island is Kyushu, and then the fourth of the four major islands is Shikoku. So the population of Japan is about 120 million people. Today, Japan is very secular. In fact, it is one of the most secular nations in the world. This is a trend that began really since World War II. But we're going to look at the religious framework of Japan and the lasting legacy on the culture. Japan is divided into 47 prefectures, which are like states, and multiple prefectures compose different regions. So, for instance, this region is called Tohoku. That's a region we're going to be talking about quite a bit. So, Japan historically has practiced two major religions, the first being Shintoism. Shintoism is the native religion of Japan. It is rooted in ancient shamanism and animism. So worship of nature. There can be an infinite number of gods. There can be a god of rivers and then a god of a specific sacred river. So what designates a Shinto shrine are these torii gates, which again designate a sacred space in Shintoism, and also these ropes decorated with these white paper ornaments. This is the island of Miyajima. This is a sacred island off the coast of Hiroshima. It was not affected by the atomic bomb. And once again, you have the torii gates, this time in the water, designating that you are entering a sacred Shinto space. Shinto religion focuses a lot on the mythology of the creation of Japan and the Japanese people. So it doesn't really touch upon the creation of the rest of the world and non-Japanese people. One of the most famous myths in the Shinto mythology deals with the event depicted here. This is a triptych woodblock print depicting a scene from Shinto mythology when the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami becomes very angered by the behavior of another god. And so she hides herself in a cave and rolls a stone to block the entrance. So darkness falls upon the land, and the other gods decide they have to devise some kind of plan to get her out and restore sun to the world. And so they decide to have a matsuri, which is a festival. And so this is considered the birth of the festival, the birth of music, and the birth of dance. So you see the drums, the flutes, and the dancing. So this is, again, considered the birth of music and dance in the Shinto worldview. So most of the ancient myths of Shintoism were recorded in a work called the Kojiki, which is translated as a record of ancient matters. And this was compiled in the year 712 AD. And Kitaro is a contemporary Japanese musician and composer. And he created a whole album to tell the story of the Kojiki mythology in music. And so I included an excerpt from the part of his album of the Matsuri to fool the sun goddess back out of the cave. And I'm including this because it sounds a lot like Matsuri today. And if you ever go to Japan, you may encounter a festival. You'll hear the drums, you'll hear the flute, and when the drummers hit the drum, they often say sa, which keeps the rhythm. And this is the kind of activity that St. Nicholas of Japan encountered as he walked the streets of the cities and towns of Japan. It's not connected? Where's my friend? It should be a little louder than this. Little technical difficulties. Well, I have a few more. Okay, here it is. So another aspect of the Kojiki is its use to justify the authority of the emperor. So according to the mythology in the Kojiki, the emperors of Japan are direct descendants of the sun goddess. So they are living gods according to Shinto tradition. So according to the Kojiki, the sun goddess gave these three sacred treasures to her descendants. And these continue to be used in the coronation ceremonies of the Japanese emperors. This is a artistic rendering of the sacred mirror, the sacred sword, and the sacred jewel. Now I say artistic rendering because these objects are not on view to the public, so we don't actually know what they look like. But these are based on other artifacts that have been found in Japan. Some scholars don't even know whether they exist anymore or if they've been copied over many times. This is the closest you're ever going to get to seeing the sacred treasures. This photo was taken in 1989 at the succession of Emperor Akihito. In boxes wrapped in silk are the sacred jewel and the sacred sword. The sacred mirror is rarely taken out of the shrine in which it is kept. So that is sort of the background in Shintoism. The second religion that was traditionally practiced in Japan is Buddhism. So Buddhism began in India around 400 BC. It spread eastward through Buddhist missionaries to China and Korea. And then in the early centuries after Christ, when Japan was engaged in cultural exchange and diplomacy with China and Korea, Japan received Buddhism. At first, it was practiced only by the royal court until it was officially established as the faith of the Japanese people in the year 593 AD by Prince Shotoku. Prince Shotoku was the regent for his aunt, the Empress Suiko, for much of the 6th century. This is an ancient painting of Prince Shotoku with a Buddhist priest. Many Japanese will tell you Shintoism and Buddhism have always coexisted peacefully side by side in Japan. That's not exactly true. So there was a lot of opposition by certain segments of society to Buddhism when it was first institutionalized in Japan. There were two major clans surrounding the royal family at the time, the Mononobe clan and the Soga clan. The Soga clan accepted Buddhism. The Mononobe clan believed that the new religion would anger the native Shinto gods. And so there was a lot of violence, but ultimately the Soga family was triumphant. So that was determined to be a sign that Buddhism was acceptable for the Japanese people. So the relationship between these religions is one of syncretism. In Japanese Buddhist theology, the gods of Shintoism are a manifestation of the Buddha according to local traditions. So that's me with another exchange student in front of one of the most famous Buddhist sites in Japan, which is the Great Buddha of Kamakura, constructed of bronze in the year 1252. It was housed in a very large temple until the late 15th century when there was a great tsunami that completely washed away the temple. So since then, the Buddha has been in the open air. This Buddhist statue belongs to the Jodoshu, or Pure Land sect of Buddhism. So Buddhism, like many other religions, has different sects and denominations. Japanese people will also sometimes tell you all of the different sects of Buddhism have peacefully coexisted side by side in Japan. Again, not exactly true. So one particular example of difficulties for a distinct Buddhist sect was Nichiren Buddhism. It was founded by the monk Nichiren in the 13th century, and he studied all of the sects of Buddhism, including Pure Land, and he determined that the only path toward enlightenment was the exclusive use of the Lotus Sutra, which is one of the Buddhist sacred texts, at the exclusion of all of the other texts. So for this, he was tried for heresy, he was sentenced to death, and when the death sentence was being carried out, there was a solar eclipse. So the authorities decided rather than to execute him, they would exile him to a remote island. So this is a woodblock print by the famous woodblock artist Kuniyoshi, and it depicts the exile of the monk Nichiren, and sort of picks up on some of the details of the legends built up around his exile. So as I said, Buddhism and Shintoism, over time have developed this relationship of syncretism, really for 1,000 years before any other religion makes its way to the Japanese shores. And in traditional Japanese life, the different religions would be sort of utilized for different events in one's life. So the first major event in life in Japan is Shichigo-san. This is a holiday celebrated in November. Shichigo-san means 753. So this is when children are brought to the Shinto shrine when they are 7, 5, and 3 years old. The girls dress in these very colorful kimono. The boys are in these formal wide pants called hakama with a top robe. And again, as you can see, this is a Shinto shrine designated with the rope and the paper ornaments. They are brought to the Shinto shrine when they're 7, 5, and 3 years old for a blessing by the Shinto priests. Once again, you see the Tori gates, which is another designation of a sacred space in Shintoism, the parents with their children for Shichigo-san. The next major event, which was observed in a religious sense in traditional Japanese culture, is the wedding. And the wedding was also traditionally Shinto. So most Japanese today do not have a religious wedding. In fact, less than 10% will have a Shinto wedding. Many Japanese have a Christian-style wedding. Sometimes they hire white people to pretend to be like Christian ministers. They just think it's all Disneyland, it's all big, goofy white dresses. This couple has chosen to have a traditional Shinto wedding. The bride is in a white kimono with this large hood. The groom in the hakama, formal wide pants, usually in gray, and the top coat is black with the kamon, which are the family crests. And this is the procession into the Shinto shrine. A blessing takes place of the couple in the Shinto shrine. This is a view from the back. You'll see, again, the bride's large hood. That is symbolically meant to hide her horns of jealousy over the potential infidelity of her husband. So it's a very serious occasion, a Shinto wedding. There's also an exchange of cups of sake. So again, historically, the realm of the wedding was Shinto, but again, very few couples will have this kind of traditional wedding today. However, the next major event in one's life, which is the last event in the earthly life, the funeral, is generally observed in a religious sense, and it is almost exclusively Buddhist. So even though Japan is a secular country, over 90% of people still have a Buddhist funeral, and many families who are not religious will continue to observe the Buddhist memorials. So these are held on the 7th day, the 49th day, 6 months, and then yearly after a person dies. So now we come to Christianity. Christianity first arrives in Japan in the 16th century with the arrival of the Portuguese. So this is an old Japanese painting depicting the Portuguese first arriving in Japan, and apparently they were fascinated by the fact that the Portuguese had pets that they kept on leashes. At this time, the Portuguese were engaged in transatlantic exploration. They arrived in the port of Nagasaki in the 1540s, Japan began engaging in trade with 4 Western nations: England, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal. But the Protestant countries were only there to trade. There was no missionary activity. But the Catholic Church, through the Portuguese and Spanish, did engage in missionary work, and they were quite successful. It began with Francis Xavier, or Francisco Javier, who was a Basque priest employed by the Portuguese. This is from an old Japanese folding screen depicting a mass in Japan. So as the turn of the century came, so about the year 1600, Christianity had become quite successful in Japan. You had people from all different levels of society who were accepting Christianity. However, there was some opposition. So in about the year 1600, an individual named Tokugawa Ieyasu, or Ieyasu Tokugawa, so in Japanese, the family name, which is Tokugawa, comes first, and then the given name. Tokugawa Ieyasu, I'll try to stick with the English form for all of the names that we're going to go through today. So Ieyasu Tokugawa was adamantly anti-Christian, and when he took charge in the position of shogun, which was really the ruler of the country. So the emperors, who were living gods, remained in the old capital. They were expected to do poetry and kind of stay outside of the public view. But it was the warrior class at this time that really controlled Japan, the highest being the shogun. And Tokugawa Ieyasu established himself and his family as the shogun for 250 years. This is a painting of Ieyasu Tokugawa. And through him and his grandson, Ieyasu Tokugawa, Japan entered the stage of sakoku, which is the complete closing of the country. So all foreigners were expelled. No foreigner was permitted to enter Japan under penalty of death. No Japanese could leave Japan under penalty of death, and nobody could practice Christianity in Japan under penalty of death. So this launched a great persecution of Christians throughout the 17th century. So when there was a suspected Christian, there would be a kind of test that was done to determine whether that individual was Christian. And that test was performed using these. These are called fumie, or trampling images. And these are often depictions of Christ or the Virgin Mary. They're usually made out of bronze. And when there was a suspected Christian, they would be compelled to step on this image. And that meant either they were not Christian or that they were renouncing their faith. And of course, those who refused to step on the image were tortured into trying to get them to renounce their faith, or they were executed. Very few fumie survived because they were so worn down from all of the people who had to step on them. This is a print depicting the interrogation of a suspected Christian. As you can see, the suspect is compelled to trample on the image of the crucifixion. Present are a Buddhist priest, the scribe, and the inquisitor. Here I have a few stills from the 2016 movie Silence, starring Liam Neeson and directed by Martin Scorsese. The film is based on the book, also called Silence, by the Japanese Catholic writer Shusaku Endo. So the story is partially based on true events regarding the experience of the Japanese Christians during the 17th century, their trials and tribulations, the kinds of tests that they had to go through. And the movie and the book concern itself also with the arrival of a group of Portuguese priests who decided to return to Japan to administer to the faithful and provide the sacraments. And of course, the ramifications once their activity was discovered. So Japan, from this period, from about the 1600s, entered this era known as the Edo period, in which it was closed to the rest of the world. And for the first 100 years, you have very active persecution of Christians, and then Christianity kind of disappears from the public view. Of course, it didn't disappear completely. It just went very much underground. This is a monument in Nagasaki, which depicts a group of 26 Catholics who were executed in Nagasaki. Ironically, the method that was used was crucifixion. So Japan remains closed for about 250 years until the arrival of the Americans under an admiral named Commodore Perry. So Commodore Perry arrives in the 1850s, and he arrives with a large warship and sends a message to the authorities saying, "We want to engage in trade, you're going to open up the country." And the authorities responded, "Oh no, Japan is sacred land, no foreigner can step foot on our sacred, peaceful land." And Commodore Perry said, "Well, tough, you're going to have to open up." Because, of course, Commodore Perry arrived on a great warship with guns and cannons, and the Japanese were still fighting with swords. So this is a 19th century woodblock print of Commodore Perry's warship. As you can see, it's kind of a depiction that is typical of the time of foreigners and foreign instruments and technology, which is sort of one of fear, something that's scary, but also somewhat kind of comical and not serious. And it was kind of serendipitous when Commodore Perry arrived in Japan, because at the time there were many other interesting things going on in Japan. So for one, the shogunate, the samurai system, was starting to collapse, and then a very unusual individual came on the throne of the chrysanthemum throne, which is the Japanese Yamato dynasty. It is the oldest dynasty in the world. And that individual was Emperor Meiji. So this is a photograph of him in the traditional Japanese garb, and then on the right in Western fashion. So a lot of people have compared Emperor Meiji to Emperor Peter the Great of Russia. Emperor Meiji moves the capital from the old city of Kyoto to Tokyo. He also centralizes the government. He disbands the samurai system and, again, centralizes the authority in the imperial family. And finally, Christianity is legalized, along with the introduction of Western fashion and Western technology. And that is when finally St. Nicholas of Japan enters our story. So this is a photograph of a young St. Nicholas of Japan. So St. Nicholas was born Ivan Dmitrievich Kasatkin in the village of Beryoza, that's in the Smolensk region of Russia. He was the son of a deacon, again born 1836. He entered the seminary of Smolensk, and then he went on and graduated from the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. He chose to become a monk. And again, at this time, Japan was starting to open up to the world, and there was a post for a young priest in Japan, and St. Nicholas applied, and he got the position. He was very much inspired by the missionary bogatyr, as they were called, the missionary bogatyrs. These were the missionary epic heroes of Russia in the 19th century, various clergy who traveled to the Far East and even over the ocean to preach the Orthodox Christian faith, which included Saint Innocent Innocenti Beniamino. This is a painting of him with the Unangan people of the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. And Saint Innocenti was really a mentor to Saint Nicholas, and Saint Nicholas really respected his methods and was encouraged to engage in some of the same work in Japan. So Saint Nicholas arrives in Japan in 1861. So again, a map of Japan. Japan opened up through the Americans to the west. There were 4 major ports: Nagasaki in the south, Kobe, which is in central Japan, Yokohama, which is next to Tokyo, and then in the north, Hakodate. And Hakodate is the city in which Russian traders and merchants first engaged in various activities in Japan. And they built an Orthodox church in Hakodate. So this is the first Orthodox church in Japan, completed in 1860. It was a small church to accommodate the Russian merchants who were in the city of Hakodate. And that really was St. Nicholas's primary purpose initially of going to Japan, was to administer to the Russians that were there. But very soon he took on his great dream, which was to start preaching to the Japanese people. So he embarked on a lifelong process of learning to read and write Japanese, studying Japanese history, culture, and of course, religion. And although Christianity came to be legalized in Japan, there was still a lot of opposition. And as I mentioned, Emperor Meiji had disbanded the samurai system. So a lot of samurai became ronin, which is masterless samurai, former samurai. They were very disillusioned, and many of them went to Hokkaido, to the north, because that was sort of the Wild West of Japan, kind of frontier territory. And many of them arrived in the city of Hakodate. And one individual, his name was Takuma Sawabe, former samurai, was pretty angered by the presence of St. Nicholas in Hakodate. And one day he went up to St. Nicholas and said, "I'm going to kill you." And St. Nicholas said, "Well, why?" And Sawabe said, "Because you are preaching a foreign, evil religion." And St. Nicholas said, well, how do you know that it's evil? And Soabe didn't really have a reply. And St. Nicholas said, well, do you really know anything about my religion? And Soabe had to admit he knew very little about Orthodox Christianity. So St. Nicholas said, why don't you come tomorrow and we can have tea and I'll tell you a little bit about my religion. And if you still think it's evil, then you can kill me. So as for the way in which Soabe planned to kill St. Nicholas, I will now demonstrate. Just kidding. Actually, I'm not an authority on kendo, which is the art of the sword, but I brought this sword to show you the kinds of weapons that the Japanese had when the Americans arrived. It's beautiful, but of course, it's no match for guns and cannons. And this is likely the kind of weapon that Takuma Soabe threatened St. Nicholas with. So the next day, Soabe does show up, and they have tea, and Soabe is very much impressed by the Orthodox faith and by the teachings of St. Nicholas. So he embarks on a study of the Orthodox faith, and eventually he's catechized, and then he is baptized by St. Nicholas. And in fact, not only does he become an Orthodox Christian, but Soabe becomes the first Japanese Orthodox priest. So this is the man who threatened St. Nicholas's life. A little later, becomes a priest of the Orthodox Church. So, as I said, St. Nicholas embarks on this lifelong process of learning the Japanese language, history, and culture. His goal was to immediately translate as much as possible into Japanese, the sacred texts of the church, the Bible, and of course, the sacred services. And to do that, he enlists the help of a friend. This is St. Nicholas with Sugimaro Nakai, church name Pavel. Oh, by the way, Takuma Soabe also took the name Pavel. So Sugimaro Nakai was a Confucian scholar. So he was an authority on kanji, which is the Chinese character system that is adapted into Japanese. So this would kind of be like being an expert on etymology of words, understanding Latin and Greek roots, because St. Nicholas really wanted to ensure that the deep meaning of the Orthodox Church could be brought into the language properly. And together they coined the term for the Orthodox Church in Japanese, Haristosu Seikyokai. So the word Haristosu is a Japanese adaptation of the word Christos from Greek. Kyokai is kind of the universal term for churches in the Christian tradition. And then this character, sei, means like true or correct. So Japanese makes use of 3 different writing systems that have to be used simultaneously. So the Chinese character system, and then that's called kanji, katakana, which is here. This is the alphabet for foreign words or names. And then the third alphabet is another phonetic writing system called hiragana, which is used for Japanese grammar and sort of idiomatic expressions. So now for a Japanese lesson. Everybody can read along with me. Haristosu shiyori fukatsu shi, shi o motte shi o horoboshi, haka ni aru mono ni inochi o tamaeri. So this is, of course, the Paschal Troparion. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. And you can see examples of katakana, this sort of straight, simple writing system for foreign words or names, the complex Chinese-based character system, and then hiragana, which are these sort of simple, curvy letters. So now you have a sense of how Japanese works. And another activity, of course, of St. Nicholas was the building of churches, and it was his dream to build a cathedral in Tokyo. And that was finally accomplished in the year 1891 with the building of the Holy Resurrection Cathedral. This is in the Ochanomizu section of Tokyo, not too far from the Imperial Palace. And as you can imagine, it was quite a remarkable edifice when it was completed in 1891. From almost the beginning, it became affectionately known as Nikoraido, which means the Hall of Nicholas, because the Japanese from the beginning so associated it with him. He really became a fixture in Tokyo, and he was very well respected among not just Christian Japanese, but the Japanese population in general. So it was also St. Nicholas's goal to employ as many Japanese in church roles as possible, and to make use of as few foreign church workers. And so one of the roles that he felt was necessary to fill was the role of iconographer. And he chose a young woman named Rin Yamashita to take on this role. So Rin Yamashita was the daughter of a former samurai. She always loved art, and as a young woman was attending an arts college in Tokyo when she met St. Nicholas, and she became an Orthodox Christian. She studied primarily under Antonio Fontanesi, who was an Italian painter who was hired by the Japanese government to teach Western-style painting in Japan. So this is a photo of Antonio Fontanesi with a group of his students. In the front right, sitting is Yamashita Rin. So once she agreed to take on this role as iconographer for the Orthodox Church of Japan, she was sent to St. Petersburg. She was likely the first Japanese woman to study in Russia. She studied iconography there in the 1880s, which was a time when Russia was experiencing the Russian revivalist movement. So this was kind of an emphasis on the old forms and sort of Byzantine modes of icon painting. However, because of the influence of her Italian professor, and because she really just loved Italian art, she returned to Japan and painted in kind of Western style iconography. So this is her Annunciation. This is the intercession of the Virgin Mary, and then this is the birth of Christ. So Japanese writing traditionally is written vertically, and it's read from right to left. Modern Japanese, as we saw, is written horizontally and read left to right. However, in the Meiji period, even horizontal writing was read from right to left. So this is read this way: Haristosu Kotan, the Nativity of Christ. So this is a map of all of the known churches to possess icons by Yamashita Rin. So she was quite prolific, and as you can see, there are churches on all four of the four major Japanese islands that possess icons by Rin Yamashita. And the church name she took was Irina. So even today in Japan, you have to have legally a Japanese first name and a Japanese last name. So any Orthodox Christians will also have a Japanese name in addition to their church name. So St. Nicholas was finally elevated to the position of bishop in the year 1880. And in order to receive this honor, he traveled back to Russia. But rather than to travel across Russia, he traveled the other way. So he sailed across the Pacific to San Francisco. He then took the transatlantic railway. He did visit New York City. And then he continued on to Europe. This was in 1879. He did make it back to St. Petersburg for his elevation to bishop. He was later ordained as archbishop. And after that, of course, he returns to Japan and continuing with his notion that the Japanese church should be maintained by the Japanese people. He founds seminaries. This is St. Nicholas with the faculty and graduates of the men's seminary, 1907. And this is a photo of St. Nicholas with the faculty and graduates of the women's seminary, 1908. And if you look second from the left in the front row here is Varvara Nakai. And she was the younger sister of Tsugumaro Nakai, who, if you remember, helped St. Nicholas in translation work. And like her brother, she was trained as a Confucian scholar. So not only did she teach religion at the Orthodox seminary, but she also taught the Chinese classics at a women's college. In fact, she was invited by the Chinese imperial government to go to China to help found a women's college there. But she chose to stay in Japan so that she could continue teaching at the Orthodox Women's Seminary. So in 1891, that was a momentous year for the church, a special guest arrived in Japan, and the whole public was excited about this visit, not only the Orthodox Christians, but the Japanese public in general. The guest arrived in Nagasaki. This is a picture of him in a rickshaw after just arriving in the port of Nagasaki. You might recognize him. This is Tsar Nicholas II. So at the time, he wasn't the Tsar yet. He was the Tsesarevich, the crown prince. He embarked on a trip halfway around the world with his cousin, Prince George of Greece. They embarked from Trieste. They went through the Suez Canal. They stopped in India. They also stopped in Siam, present-day Thailand. They met the king of Siam, King Chulalongkorn, who is the inspiration for the king and the king and I. And then finally, they made their way to Japan and landed in Nagasaki. So this is the imperial Fabergé egg that was given by Alexander III to his wife, Maria Fyodorovna, for Easter 1891. So the egg itself is made out of jasper, and the surprise inside is a miniature version of the Pamyat Azova, which is the Memory Azov ship. And this is the ship which their son, Crown Prince Nicholas, sailed on to Japan. As you can see, the ship is on an ocean bed made of aquamarine. So, a very momentous occasion. However, it was marred by tragedy. So as Crown Prince Nicholas was traveling up to Tokyo, he stopped in the town of Otsu, which is a resort town outside of Kyoto, and something occurred. It's become known as the Otsu incident, and that was when he was attacked. He was attacked by a disgruntled former Japanese police officer that was known to suffer from mental illness. This is a French publication depicting the event, the Otsu event. The former police officer slashed Crown Prince Nicholas on the head. He was left with a scar on his forehead. And when the perpetrator attempted a second blow, Nicholas's cousin, Prince George of Greece, held up his walking stick, and that blocked the second blow and likely saved Tsar Nicholas's life. The perpetrator was caught, he was sentenced to life in prison, and died shortly thereafter. But this was extremely shameful for the Japanese people, that an honored guest had his life threatened in Japan. So the Emperor Meiji sent an apology to Crown Prince Nicholas, which is very unusual in that time because the emperor is a living god, so the emperor rarely apologized for anything. And Emperor Meiji also sent St. Nicholas of Japan down from Tokyo down to Kobe, which is where Crown Prince Nicholas was recovering. And so this is another role that St. Nicholas of Japan took on, which was to kind of be a diplomat and facilitating of good relations between Japan and Russia. And he was trusted by the Meiji Emperor to do this. So unfortunately, Crown Prince Nicholas does not make it to Tokyo. He leaves from Kobe and sails back to Russia. But at this time, the sentiment in Japan was very pro-Russian. Again, people felt great shame over what happened. However, the public and governments can often be very fickle. And so not too many years later, another tragedy ensues, which is the Russo-Japanese War. And the details of the war are kind of complicated. I don't know if I have enough time to get into it all, but basically it concerned imperialism that both Russia and Japan were engaging in at the time in northeastern Asia. It concerned the Kuril Islands, which is this group of islands off of the coast of Hokkaido, stretching up to the Kamchatka Peninsula, and Sakhalin, both of which are homelands of the indigenous Ainu people. And then imperialism in both Korea and Manchuria, which is this northeastern part of China. And Japan had requested some kind of an agreement with the Russian government regarding imperialism in this region. And for decades, the Russian government had refused to make any sorts of deal. But Japan was really on the move with Emperor Meiji modernizing, expanding. He saw what Western powers were doing in terms of imperialism, so he really didn't want to wait any longer. So the Japanese bombed Port Arthur. Port Arthur is a part of China that at the time was on a long-term lease to Russia, and the whole Russian naval fleet was destroyed. And the Japanese then declared war on Russia. Tsar Nicholas, he had already become Tsar at the time. He did not favor the war, but felt it was necessary. The Russians had to transport all of their military and all of their weapons and supplies across thousands of miles before they even reached the battleground. And this occurred in 1904. The war lasted through 1905. And the Russians did very poorly. And it was very clear that the Russians had lost the war. But there were very, very high number of casualties on both sides. It was an extremely expensive war. So both sides wanted a peace to be brokered. And finally, that was achieved through a mediator, and that mediator was Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt was the President of the United States. He drafted the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was signed by both the Japanese and Russians, ending the Russo-Japanese War. For this, Teddy Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize. This is a photograph of Teddy Roosevelt in the middle, with the primary representatives of Russia, including Sergei Witte, and the primary representatives of Japan, including Junko Komura. So Teddy Roosevelt was also influential in the founding of the Museum of Natural History on the Upper West Side here in New York City. And if you go in the lobby, the north wall is dedicated with murals to the peace brokered by Teddy Roosevelt after the Russo-Japanese War. So I went over there and made a little video. On the one end of the north wall, the murals are dedicated to Japan, beginning with Emperor Jimmu, who is the legendary first emperor of Japan. the devastation caused to the Japanese people with a Shinto priest, and a symbolic representation of peace between the two countries. Heiwa in Japanese, Mir in Russian, and Emperor Meiji on the left, and Tsar Nicholas on the right. The other end of the wall is dedicated to Russia, beginning with Saint Olga with her birds, which is a legend for another day, and the church, the golden church domes. And the devastation caused to the Russian people by the war with an Orthodox priest. And the actual signing of the treaty. So you have TR here for Teddy Roosevelt, the principal signer of the document for Russia, Sergei Witte, and again, the principal signer for Japan, Junko Komura, written in Russian and Japanese. So take a look next time you're in the museum. So during this period, St. Nicholas of Japan was advised to return to Russia. He refused to do so. He remained in Japan throughout the Russo-Japanese War. He chose not to serve during this time period because as part of the liturgies in both Japan and Russia were prayers for the emperor and prayers for victory of each country. But then after the Russo-Japanese War, St. Nicholas resumes his activity in Japan. And he sadly dies in 1912. So this is a photograph of his funeral procession. It is estimated that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people attended his funeral. As I said, he was beloved not only by the Japanese Orthodox, but the Japanese populace in general, especially the people of Tokyo, as he had lived for decades in the Ochanomizu section, where the cathedral now bears his name, colloquially. And he was buried in Yanaka Cemetery in Tokyo. This is his grave, his tomb, and I don't know if anyone recognizes the two over here. This is Nicholas Richard, and this is Deacon Matthew. I don't know if they're here today, but yeah. From the time that St. Nicholas dies, he is popularly venerated as a saint by the Japanese Orthodox people. The official glorification took place in 1970, and he was awarded the title of Ravna Kostani, in Japanese, Ashito Sei Nikolai, which is equal to the apostles. So he is in fact one of only 3 individuals of Russian descent who have been awarded this distinction. The first being St. Olga of Kiev, the second being her grandson St. Vladimir, and the third being St. Nicholas of Japan. So after he was recognized as a saint, a portion of his relics were deposited in the cathedral in Tokyo. This is a portion of St. Nicholas's relics, along with the previous Metropolitan of Japan, Metropolitan Daniel, who died in 2023, and the current Metropolitan of the Japanese Orthodox Church, Seraphim, who was then the Bishop of Sendai. So now we're going to look at some of the things that occurred in the 20th century. 20th century was a very difficult time for the Japanese Orthodox Church, despite its great beginnings in the 19th century. Of course, the century begins with the Russo-Japanese War, which was difficult for the church because many Japanese viewed the Orthodox Church with suspicion because of its connection historically to Russia. Then, of course, the death of St. Nicholas in 1912 was a great blow to the Japanese Orthodox Church because he was such a charismatic, intelligent, and enthusiastic person that there was really nobody to fill his shoes. And then the next blow to the church actually occurred thousands of miles away, and that was the Russian Revolution. So this is a painting by Ivan Vladimirov depicting the burning of a painting of Tsar Nicholas II during the Russian Revolution. The church in Japan had been completely funded by the Russian government, and then after the Russian Revolution, the Japanese church was completely cut off from Russia and abruptly received no funding. So this was very difficult for a rather young, growing church. It had only existed for about 60, 70 years at this point, and almost overnight, the Japanese Orthodox Church had to become completely self-sufficient. Another major blow to the Japanese Orthodox Church occurred in 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake, which hit the Kanto region of Japan, which is where Tokyo is located. As a result of this earthquake, the bell tower of the cathedral in Tokyo fell into the dome, which was a great devastation to this really amazing building. So this is a photograph taken shortly after the earthquake in 1923. As you can see, the bell tower is gone, the dome is gone, and the entire city is in rubble. So another difficult time for the Japanese Orthodox Church occurred only a decade and a half later, and that was World War II. So this is a photograph of the Japanese army marching on Nanjing, China. This is sometimes known as the Rape of Nanking. As a result of Japanese imperialism in Asia, which ultimately led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japan became involved in what we know as World War II. And the Soviet Union, of course, was on opposite sides of Japan. So once again, the Japanese viewed the Orthodox Church with suspicion, even though the Japanese Orthodox Church had absolutely no connection with the Soviet Union at this time, but it was still viewed with suspicion due to the Russian history of the church. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, Japan is occupied by the United States. And at this time, a particular individual takes interest in the Orthodox Church in Japan and oversees its leadership. And that individual is Boris Pashkovsky, who is better known as Boris Pash. So Boris Pash was an important figure in American military intelligence. He was of Russian descent. His father, in fact, was a bishop. And he oversaw the direction of the Japanese Orthodox Church in the post-war era. In this time period, the leadership of the Japanese Orthodox Church comes under the guidance of the OCA, the Orthodox Church of America. So here is a shameless plug of a book written by my friend Ilya Karin. Ilya and I graduated from Georgetown and same year, and both of us were Japanese majors. He went on to receive his PhD from Princeton, and he published his doctoral thesis as this book, which is titled After Nicholas. So this is the best and really the only book I know of in English about this period. This sort of, again, it's called After Nicholas, the period from 1912 through the early post-World War II era. There is more scholarship in Japanese. There's, of course, a growing scholarship in Russian, but this is really the only source about this time period in English. So it was very difficult for the Japanese church during this time because of the rise of Japanese imperialism. Even though Christianity was legal, Christians really had to demonstrate their loyalty to the Japanese emperor, who again was a god in Shintoism. But of course, Orthodox Christians worked very hard to maintain their theology. So it was a very difficult balance. But the church did survive. As I said, the leadership of the church kind of floundered around from being completely independent. There was a time when there was a Rocor bishop that was elevated, and then the Orthodox Church of America. Finally, in 1970, the Orthodox Church of Japan receives autonomy through the Moscow Patriarch, so its status is very similar to the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. So now we're going to take a look at the Japanese church today. The Japanese Orthodox Church, as I said, is an autonomous Orthodox church. It is divided into 3 dioceses. The Archdiocese of Tokyo, which is headquartered in Tokyo, the Eastern Diocese, headquartered in Sendai, and the Western Diocese, headquartered in Kyoto. And I should point out, in Japanese parlance, generally, when they refer to Southern Japan, it's called Western Japan, and Northern Japan is called Eastern Japan. And this is the count of the number of churches in each diocese. The total is around 70. It might be a little more than that. When St. Nicholas died in 1912, the number of Orthodox Christians was about 40,000, and it was roughly the same number of Catholics and Protestants. But the Orthodox are particularly remarkable because the Catholics and Protestants had dozens of foreign missionaries, whereas the Orthodox Church really only had one, which was St. Nicholas. And today, the number of Orthodox Christians in Japan is about the same number, 40,000. So it was very hard for the church to experience growth in the 20th century, but a lot of families have preserved the faith from generation to generation. The number of active members is sometimes estimated quite lower at about 10,000, and that kind of reflects the general secularization of Japanese society. This is the current Metropolitan. You saw a picture of him before. Previously, the Bishop of Sendai, Metropolitan Seraphim, who resides in Tokyo today. So let's look at some aspects that distinguish Orthodoxy in Japan. The Orthodox Church generally utilizes a method called acculturization, where the church sort of takes in the local culture without syncretism, without sacrificing any of its theology. So if you remember, the first major event that is historically observed in a religious fashion in Japan is Shichigo-san. When the children are 753, they're brought to the Shinto shrine for blessing. The Japanese Orthodox Church has composed a specific blessing ceremony for Shichigo-san, so that if you are an Orthodox Christian family, rather than to take the child for a blessing at the Shinto shrine, you can bring them for the special blessing at the Orthodox Church. And similarly, the children wear their festive kimono. This is a very old photograph of St. Nicholas of Japan at Nikoraido with a group of children. And based on the festive attire that the children are wearing, such as this little girl in this festive vest that is worn on top of the kimono, this might have been one of the first Shichigo-san celebrations in the Orthodox Church. The next major event, as we talked about, is the wedding. As I said, most Japanese do not have a religious wedding today and generally wear Western fashion. This Orthodox couple has chosen to wear the traditional garments. This couple, of course, are in Western fashion. The Japanese generally do not hold the crowns over the head. Rather, in the Orthodox Church of Japan, the crowns are clipped to these poles. So this is a clip from a wedding video of a wedding that took place at the Orthodox Church in Gunma Prefecture. And this is the part where the priest is doing the gospel reading, the account of the miracle at Cana. And I was trying to figure out where to cut it, and it felt weird kind of cutting through halfway, through the gospel reading. So I have included the full gospel reading according to St. John during this wedding ceremony. It's about 2 minutes. So just listen for the word sake, which is used in place of the word wine. Let's make sure this is on. It's not on.
Battery 100%. Connected to CMS and iCloud.
See if it works.
慎み座で制服隠居を聞くべし囚人に変や弱めの制服隠居の読みかの時ガリレアのカナに公園ありイーススの母も賢にありきイーススを呼びその門徒もまた公園に招かれたり酒の乏しきによりてイーススの母はこれに言う彼らに酒なしイースス曰く女よ我となんぞ預からん我の時いまだ至らずその母の諸僕に言う彼らが何時らに命ずるところを行え賢にユーデヤ人の清めの霊に従いて石の水がめ6つありおのおのに3度いるイーシス諸僕に言う亀に水を満たせこれに満たしてほとんどあふるまた彼らに言う今組手支援者に送れすなわち送れり支援者は先に返じたる水をなめてそのいずれよりするを知らされきただ水を汲みし諸僕これを知れり花婿を呼びて彼に言うおよその人はまず良き酒を勧めて酒縄なるに及びて悪しき酒を進む汝は良き酒のとどめて今に至れりかくのごとくイーススガリレアのカナにおいて宮長の初めて立ちてその光栄を表せりその門と彼を信ぜり
event we discussed, which is the last event in one's earthly life, is the funeral. So in Japan, it has been a law since 1947 that all individuals who die in Japan must be cremated. So the Orthodox Church exercises ikonomia, which is the building up of the church, such that all Orthodox Christians will be given a full Orthodox funeral before they are cremated. And as you will see, the kutia or koliva for the dead looks a little different. That is because rather than to use wheat, the Japanese use sweet white rice. And it is often decorated with these colorful star-like candies called konpeito. Konpeito are a traditional Japanese sweet that were actually introduced by the Portuguese in the 16th century. And of course, another distinguishing factor about Orthodox churches in Japan is that often one has to take off one's shoes. So this is not the case at the cathedral in Tokyo, but many other churches in Japan, you will have to take off your shoes. But if it is a cold winter day, they usually do provide slippers, as you can see. Okay, so now we're going to take a brief pilgrimage through Japan. As I mentioned, there are about 70 churches. It's a little too many to cover. There are many interesting, beautiful churches. I just chose a few of the highlights, of course, starting with the most famous Orthodox church in Japan, which is the Holy Resurrection Cathedral in Tokyo, affectionately known as the Hall of Nicolaido. This photo was taken shortly after the church was rebuilt after the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. I believe it was completed restoration work in 1929. The photo was taken from Ochanomizu Women's University, which overlooks the cathedral. And you'll notice that the dome is, the dome is the original style dome. It was Neo-Byzantine architecture. That was the original design. But the bell tower is, of course, much shorter than the original design from before the earthquake. It is still a stately edifice and is a real landmark for this neighborhood of Tokyo. But of course, today it is dwarfed by Tokyo skyscrapers. It is on the original property, which is quite a large property for Tokyo. You enter through the side. There are gates around the property. As I said, it's a large property. This is the main entrance to the cathedral. Opposite the cathedral are other buildings, including a church hall, residences for clergy and workers of the church. There's a building that functioned as a printing press, which I believe is being used for other purposes. This was a particularly cold day in the springtime, and there I am. And then, again, the main entrance. Above the door is the fresco of Christ, inscription in Japanese from the book of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The interior, the iconostasis. As you can see, the cathedral is really quite large. You have these pillars throughout the building. Choir practice here. You can see there's a second floor. There's the spiral staircase to the second floor. And again, it's quite a large floor space in the cathedral in Tokyo. So now probably the second most famous Orthodox church in Japan is the Church of the Resurrection in Hokkaido. And if you remember, this is the first Orthodox church built in Japan in 1860. However, the original building was burned in the Great Fire of Hokkaido in the early 20th century. So the current building was rebuilt in 1916, slightly larger actually than the original design. The location is the original location, which is on a hill overlooking the bay. So this is a really beautiful picture of the church in Hakodate around Christmas time. You can see the Christmas trees are lit. And again, because the architecture is so distinct for Japan, this Russian-style architecture, and it's such a beautiful location overlooking the bay, the church has really become a symbol of the city of Hakodate. And in fact, is used in a lot of tourist ads for northern Japan in general, for the island of Hokkaido. The interior, the iconostasis, is carved out of keyaki wood, which is a Japanese hardwood, translated as zelkova tree wood. If you want to see zelkova tree wood up close, there is a tea caddy in the case over there made out of this kind of wood. And so the church in Hakodate is affectionately known as Gangan Dera, which means Ding Dong Temple. And that is because of its distinct bell ringing. So I have this little clip here. Hopefully it'll transport you to this church by the sea on the hill in Hakodate. So the next church we're going to look at is the Church of St. John the Apostle, a historic church in the town of Ishinomaki in Miyagi Prefecture. This is in the Tohoku region of Japan, and you might have heard the word Tohoku before because it was the site of the Tohoku earthquake in 2011. And subsequent to the earthquake was a tsunami. And so the church was severely damaged and a huge amount of debris washed up near the church. So the church underwent restoration, which was completed in 2016. Here are various local representatives with then Bishop Seraphim of Sendai, currently Metropolitan Seraphim. This is the Church of St. Paul, located in the village of Akutsu, Ibaraki Prefecture. I included this church because it is built not in a sort of Neo-Byzantine or Neo-Russian design, but in fact according to a Japanese traditional architecture. So it is made out of wood with the typical tile roof and the use of the auspicious color in Japanese tradition, which is red. It also underwent a restoration work in 2014. This is a procession after the restoration was completed with the previous Metropolitan Daniel. This is the Orthodox Church of Maebashi, located in Gunma Prefecture. So Maebashi was a town that developed in the late 19th, early 20th century as a center for the silk industry. And you can look at some of the traditional Japanese silks. There's an obi, which is a sash, in the case over there. But various businessmen in the town of Maebashi really developed a very modern approach to producing raw silk, which was then exported. And when St. Nicholas was passing through the town of Maebashi, he met some of these businessmen, and one of them, Yuzo Fukasawa, became Orthodox. And he helped to found the church in the town, and I believe 40 of his factory employees converted. So it became a great center, a little town of Orthodox Christians. This is a handwritten letter by Yuzo Fukasawa to another businessman, speaking about his joy at being received into the Orthodox Church through baptism. The Maebashi Church was rebuilt numerous times and renovated due to various natural disasters. And finally, in 1970, it was reconsecrated as the Church of St. Nicholas of Japan. So this is actually the first church in the world to be dedicated to St. Nicholas of Japan. And finally, the Church of the Annunciation in the village of Hokuroku in Akita Prefecture, northern Japan. Most sources consider this to be the oldest wooden church in Japan, constructed of the local cedar wood. In the early 20th century, there was a fire in the town which destroyed everything except the church. The fire was blocked by this persimmon tree. Persimmons are these orange fruits that are very popular in Japan. And if you visit, you can still see the scars left on the tree. This is the charming interior, the icons by Irina Yamashita. Take note of the icon on the top right. It is an icon of the resurrection. And at this time, the 1891-1892 time frame, we know that Irina Yamashita painted two almost identical icons of the resurrection. This one, which is in the church in the village of Hokuroku, and the other one was prepared for a special visitor that was Crown Prince Nicholas in 1891. And we know from church documents that when St. Nicholas of Japan traveled down to meet with the Crown Prince after the assassination attempt, he did give this icon to the Crown Prince. And there are some records in Russia that it made it back to Russia. However, after the revolution, It disappeared, it was thought lost, but decades later, it was finally rediscovered in storage at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. So it is on view at the Hermitage Museum. Again, it is almost identical to the resurrection icon in the village of Hokuroku. You can see the light emanating from Christ, this sort of greenish blue background. The inscription, again written horizontally, read from left to right the Greek abbreviation for Jesus Christ. But again, the Meiji period, even horizontal writing was read from right to left, Haristosu Fukatsu, or Fukukatsu, as it was pronounced in the Meiji period. The lovely frame, which is Makie raised gold lacquer. In the center is the cross, designs of chrysanthemums throughout. This is the back. The image here is the cathedral in Tokyo, and the inscription in Japanese and Russian. And I just thought this was, really quite fascinating because it reflects the experience of the Meiji period, where you have these coming together of different cultures, the contrast between tradition and modernity. So if you look at the date in Russian, it says May 6, 1891. Now, in the Japanese, they were still reckoning the year by the year of the emperor. So it's Emperor Meiji 24. However, Emperor Meiji adopted the Gregorian calendar. So the day is May 18th, whereas the Russians were still using the older Julian calendar. So that's why it's May 6th. So we know that today the difference in calendar is 13 days. In the 19th century, it was 12 days. But it is the same day. So now I just wanted to speak briefly about a few Japanese Orthodox Christians. Japanese Orthodox Christians throughout the 19th, 20th, and 21st century include people of all walks of life, farmers, former samurai, artists, writers, and I just chose a few that kind of reflect a different way in which the Orthodox Church was received in Japan. This is Kentaro Oi, who was a politician and a member of parliament in the late Meiji era. His platform was a very progressive platform, which was universal suffrage. So this would have given the right to vote to women, as well as to the inhabitants of the areas that Japan came to colonize. So in Japan, often Christianity is associated with more progressive ways of thinking, new ideas, and a sense of a commitment to humanity in a way that is somewhat different than in traditional Buddhism and Shintoism. This is Nobori Shomu. I just included him because he was a professor at Waseda University, where I studied abroad. But he was one of the leading authorities on Russian literature in Japan, and he did some of the first translations of Japanese works, of Russian works into Japanese. This is Chiune Sugihara, also known as Senpo Sugihara. He was an Orthodox Christian who worked as a diplomat in various parts of the world. In the lead up to World War II, he was a diplomat working at the consulate in Kaunas, Lithuania. And this was the period when Hitler was taking over Eastern Europe and began to persecute Jews. So a group of Jews from Eastern Europe approached Sugihara about transit visas so that they could escape and make their way to Japan and then to other locations. And so Sugihara began issuing these visas. He issued so many of them that the Japanese government said, you have to stop doing this. And he wouldn't stop. And so he saved the lives of thousands of Jews. There is some evidence that he was going to be tried for insubordination, but in the aftermath of World War II, he was not brought to court, but he did lose his job, he was disgraced, he was forced to take various menial jobs because he defied the orders of his superiors. Later in life, a few of the Jews whom he had saved and their descendants discovered that he was still living in Japan, and he was awarded Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem, which is a Israeli Holocaust memorial organization. And he said that his Orthodox Christian faith really informed his decision to defy the orders of his superiors in order to save other human life. And this is an example of one of his transit visas, which has survived for a Jewish person from Lithuania. As you can see, Consulate of Japan, Kaunas, Lithuania, transit visa through Japan to Curacao. And finally, Asami Kuchi. Asami Kuchi was an actress who appeared in Japanese movies and television throughout the second half of the 20th century. She had no background in the Orthodox Church or Christianity, but she was invited to a concert given by the choir of the cathedral in Tokyo. And she was really amazed by the beauty of the music. She began studying about the Orthodox Church and became an Orthodox Christian. And her funeral, she died in 1996. The funeral was at the cathedral. And this is just another example of different ways in which people find the church. And in her case, it was through the music of the choir. So here I just have a clip of the cathedral choir of Nicoraido singing the Paschal Troparion. The background images are from a Russian production that was made in the early 21st century about the Japanese Orthodox Church. But the singing is the choir of Nicoraido. They'll be singing the Paschal Troparion in Slavonic, Greek, and Japanese. As for the Slavonic and Greek, you can listen for a slight Japanese accent. And then as for the Japanese, we've already gone through the words together. With the words of St. Nicholas of Japan himself. My purpose in life and my joy is the enlightenment of Japan through orthodoxy, and I believe that this will happen. I believe as firmly as I believe in God. But is Japan ready to accept orthodoxy now? Only the Lord knows. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes?
Thank you very much. First of all, that was really phenomenal. I think you topped the last presentation. This was really spectacular. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. What miracles are attributed to St. Nicholas, first of all?
And then the second question regarding the cathedral when it was built, it's really big. I mean, was there sufficient, were there parishioners sufficient in number to justify that size? And with the architecture, were there any issues with accepting that kind of style in Japan at that time? So it's
Three questions. Okay, so the first question, what are the miracles associated with St. Nicholas? There were healings in Japan and in the Russian church outside of Russia community. So a lot of the Russians who had fled eastward to China and Harbin, which came to be under Japanese control, and then moved on after communism took over China. You have some miracles there. I think it was really set that because of how unique the work was of St. Nicholas, it was inevitable that he was destined to be glorified. The second question was about the size. Yeah, so it was funded primarily through Russian contributions, the Tsar himself and a few other patrons, because again, this was before the Russian Revolution. So the church in Japan at least didn't have to worry financially until after the revolution. There was some opposition. People thought maybe it would be too big, but this was a dream of St. Nicholas's to have this lasting monument for the Japanese Orthodox Christians. Within the Orthodox community in Japan, that design was chosen, which was a Neo-Byzantine design. And, there probably were some people in Japan who probably didn't like it because they thought it was too big, too foreign, but almost immediately people fell in love with it and really looked at it as this unique monument for that section of Tokyo. Yeah. What was the third? That was it. I covered everything. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you know what's their approximate number of Orthodox Christians in Japan right now?
Yeah, so it's about 40,000, but some sources say that the active membership is only about 10,000. Yeah. Yes.
Are you familiar with Ambassador Evgeny Debutsov, who was the ambassador to Japan from Nicholas II's court?
Debutsov. Not too much, no. Do you want to enlighten us?
Well, he was my great-grandfather. But
Oh, wow. Okay.
He may have known the same.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how these different people knew each other. I mean, Tsar Nicholas, the Tsar martyr, St. Nicholas of Japan, St. Innocenti of Alaska. So there's a lot of, relationships of, devoted people, right? They find each other. Yes.
Can you shed light on any monasteries, seminaries, or convents?
Yes, well, there were seminaries. There were men's seminaries and women's seminaries. In the 20th century, they closed down. I believe that there is a men's seminary once again. It's quite small. In terms of monasticism, this was kind of a problem that St. Nicholas encountered, that he was able to find people who were very enthusiastic and became Orthodox, but very few of them wanted to go into monasticism, which I've wondered about because Japan did have a tradition of monasticism in Buddhism. So it wasn't like a totally new idea of celibacy for men and women, monks and nuns. And we know that St. Nicholas had in mind multiple times a Japanese successor, and he would send often these young men to theological academies in Russia. They returned, and he was all set for them to take vows, and then they got married. And so they did, of course, remain in the church. Many of them became priests, but they became married priests. So during his lifetime, there wasn't much opportunity to develop monasticism. Same in the 20th century. I believe now in the 21st century, there is a women's and a men's monastery, but they're like 2 or 3 people in each one, and it's not really a monastic order. It's just individuals who've sort of chosen to take vows and kind of live semi-independently. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you know how many churches are named after St. Nicholas?
Around the world, I'm not sure. Of course, the first one in Maebashi in Japan. I know there's at least one in Moscow. There's also one in South Africa. So that's at least 3. I'm not sure if in recent years new ones have been dedicated to him. It's not a huge number, but it's usually churches that are kind of connected in some way to the concept of mission. Yeah. And yes.
Are there other Orthodox churches that are not the Orthodox Church of Japan in Japan?
Yes. So the Moscow Patriarch has its own representative church in Tokyo. So if you want to hear the services in Slavonic, there's at least that one church. I believe they have a second one. And then I believe kind of controversially, the Romanians, because there are a lot of Romanians now working in Japan as well. Again, Japan doesn't really give citizenship to foreigners, but people can get work visas. And as a result, the Romanians have opened up a few churches. But again, it's kind of controversial because they haven't really coordinated with the Japanese Orthodox Church. But yeah, those are the 3 that I know, the Japanese, Moscow Patriarch, and a few under the Romanian Patriarchate. Yeah. Any other question? Yes?
You know anything about the Romanians? Because I heard that they opened up a cemetery for those who don't want to get cremated because of that issue.
Yeah, I am familiar with certain groups trying to skirt around that law. Again, Japan generally, there's no concept of religious exemption. I don't know if there's some people who somehow hide it. I don't know exactly how that works. It's probably, semi-legal. But there are foreigners who are dying there, and sometimes their families can't afford to send the bodies back to their country of origin. So there are foreigners who are buried in Japan, and technically they would be, they would have to take care of the bodies in the same way as Japanese citizens. But again, there might be people who are figuring out how to try to get around that. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, a couple. I forgot. Did he fire on Japan?
No.
No.
No, because they kind of conceded because he threatened them in, very subtle language that if they did not open up, they would face something like that. Because he arrived with this huge ship. A lot of Japanese who witnessed it claimed that they thought initially this was some kind of ship from Buddhist hell because it was so huge, so dark, they'd never seen anything like it. So it was threatening, but as far as I know, he never actually had to resort to violence.
He came with a fleet, right?
Yes, but there was the one big warship that was like very shocking to the Japanese public. Yeah.
What year did he arrive, and how much did he grow the Orthodox population during his tenure?
Right, so he arrived in 1861, and then he died in 1912, and there were roughly 40,000 Japanese Orthodox Christians when he died. Yeah. Any other question? Yes?
Is there any activity or spreading Orthodox faith in Japan, like missionary work or something?
You mean today?
Yes, today.
Not really. That kind of era has passed, particularly from the Russian tradition. Again, Russia was very much engaged in missionary activity in the 19th century in the far eastern regions of Russia and into Japan, Alaska. But with the Russian Revolution, that was abruptly cut off. And again, the church in Japan faced a lot of issues. So missionary work hasn't really resumed. It's more like, occasionally Japanese will start wondering about the spiritual life. They might get interested in Christianity and do some research and find out about Orthodoxy, but there's not really active mission work at this time. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Is there any information about opinions between the Buddhists and the Orthodox? How did they react to Orthodoxy amongst them? And then Buddhists that convert to Orthodoxy, how did they view Buddhism going from there?
Yeah, so of course it all depended on the individual. So one of St. Nicholas of Japan's closest friends was a Buddhist priest. However, there were also many Buddhist priests who were very anti-Christian. And so if there was a Buddhist temple in an Orthodox area, a lot of the Buddhist sermons would be targeted against the evil Orthodox Christian faith. And when St. Nicholas was receiving converts, a lot of them were very adamantly anti-Buddhist. And some of the new priests and catechists wanted to preach in the Orthodox Church against Buddhism. And St. Nicholas advised against that the sermons should be focused on the glory of Orthodoxy and not sort of take the approach of actively criticizing Buddhism.
Do we know any of the criticism that Buddhists had for Orthodoxy?
Well, I mean, it probably was a very general sort of anti-foreign sensibility, because probably a lot of the early Buddhists, when they first encountered Christianity, it's just like, this is foreign, this is evil, I don't want to touch it. The reverse, we actually do have now some of St. Nicholas's diaries. They were presumed lost in the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, but in fact, they were rediscovered in the KGB archives. And that's likely because after he died, many Japanese Orthodox Christians felt they should actually return to Russia, and he generally wrote in Russian. And then after the revolution, they got lost, but in fact they were not destroyed. They were kept by the Soviet authorities. So these were rediscovered in the late 20th century, and in those he talks about his views on Buddhism. And he generally admits that the Buddhists had a great sense of morality, but that their theology was, not the truth. For instance, the notion that Buddhism generally doesn't focus on whether there really is a deity or a creator. The sense that, you achieve enlightenment really through yourself, like 100% through yourself. Some sects of Buddhism, like Pure Land Buddhism, they do believe in kind of receiving salvation through the Amida Buddha, which is the Pure Land Buddha. So they have a mantra, Namo Amida Butsu, and they believe that the more you chant this, the Amida Buddha will help you. But St. Nicholas also criticized this form because he found that a lot of people felt that they could commit any sort of sin as long as they would then spend hours reciting Namo Amida Butsu. So in the diaries, you have St. Nicholas going through the different sects of Buddhism and his views on Buddhism, the positives, the negatives. He was also very critical of a lot of Russian and American dignitaries that he met who kind of became fascinated by Buddhism and didn't really know much about Christianity. So already in the early 20th century, a lot of Western people were kind of indifferent to Christianity. And
What we see going on today?
yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
I have two questions. One is, are there, besides the sort of, I guess, adaptations of Japanese culture that you've described, are there any other sort of ways in which Japanese culture has been adapted? I mean, did they use wine? Did they use grape wine in communion, or did they use?
Yes, yeah. So, I went through some of the more visual elements that, distinguish Japanese Orthodoxy from, other Orthodox traditions, but they do use wine and bread for communion. But again, some of these other things are a little different. Yeah. And, go ahead.
And I remember reading that St. Nikolai had generally good relations with other Christian missionaries in Japan, but that the Catholic missionaries in particular, there was some jealousy on their part, and they would say that Orthodoxy is only making headway in Japan because of Nikolai Kasatkin. And that
Well, yeah, he was a very
Right,
charismatic guy.
Yes, yes. And I think they were the only, among, sort of, among the Western Christians, they did not attend his funeral. I'm curious, what, like, the present state of, like...
Well, yeah, I mean, things change over time. So the question was about St. Nicholas's connection with other Christians in Japan. So it's true that he had pretty good relations with the Protestants. He was friends with the Anglican Bishop of Tokyo, and in fact was part of an organization that promoted the unification of the Anglican and Orthodox churches. But this kind of ecumenism occurred at a very different time when the theology between Protestants and Orthodox were much closer than they are today. From what I understand at that period, the Catholic Church, which the second time around in Japan was primarily French, they did not engage in sort of any interaction with other Christians. So yeah, it's unlikely that there were Catholics at his funeral, but there were many Protestants. Today, the Orthodox Church in Japan is going to be similar to as it is in the rest of the world, where you can have dialogue with everyone, but I would say that Protestants and Orthodox are much further away today, sadly, than they were 100 years ago. Yeah. Anything else? Yes?
Is the version of the liturgy used in Japan the same one that was translated by Nikolai and his Confucian scholar?
Yes, so, yeah, and so even when the liturgy was being translated, many people felt the form was a little archaic and that it might be too complicated. But St. Nicholas's attitude was to kind of elevate the people to the beauty and mystery and complexity of the liturgy rather than dumbing it down. The Orthodox Church in Japan continues to use this, although I even see some differences in the orthography. So, for instance, like tamaeri, which means bestowing like tamaeri, it's written now with eri, and it used to be heri, right? But already in the Meiji period, it was losing this ancient pronunciation. But I'm sure there are Orthodox Christians who might choose to read a modern translation of the Bible, because Nicholas's translation is a little more difficult. But the liturgy is still the original translation from the 19th century.
Is that comparative to how the Greeks and us we do it? So we still have old Slavonic, the Greeks have old Greek. So they have
Yeah, it's kind of similar to that. Yeah. Anything else? No? Okay, yes. What?
What is when the Japanese closed Japan? Did that island stay open, or did that get closed?
Yeah, there's a lot of details that are hard to cover in this, but yeah, during the period of Sakoku, when Japan was closed to outsiders, there was one tiny island where one group of foreigners was permitted. So that island was Dejima, which is a tiny island off the coast of Nagasaki, and that one group of people were the Dutch. But they were very limited in how much they could trade, the time frame, and again, they could not step foot on mainland Japan.
There was no Orthodox church on that island?
There's no Orthodox church, no Catholic church, no Protestant church. Only the Dutch could go there for trading. They could not do anything else.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Are you aware of tours of the Orthodox churches of Japan, or do you anticipate leading one within the next decade?
I mean, it might be fun to lead one. As far as I know, there's no organized sort of pilgrimage. Unfortunately, a lot of the little village churches today don't have services every Sunday. They might only have a priest travel to different churches, once a month or something like that. So if you go to Japan, of course, the cathedral in Tokyo, you'll be able to visit the church in Hakodate, the cathedral in Kyoto. But if you go to some of those little village churches, you'll really have to arrange in advance. Yeah, or bring your own priest. That helps. We do have a reception, so please have some snacks. The snacks are Japanese, the vodka is Russian, and we also have a Japanese vodka available for you. And there will be a basket if you'd like, please give for our restoration fund here at Synod. Thank you.